Step away from the vehicle.
No.
Hands where I can see him.
Officer, this is my car. I am a judge, and you are making a serious mistake.
A judge? Yeah, right. You don't belong here. Don't move.
You have no probable cause. Touch me again, and this ends your career.
Stop resisting. You're under arrest.
I am not resisting. This is unlawful.
Judge Michael Harrison was loading his twin daughter's stroller into the trunk of his sedan when he saw the police cruiser slowing down in front of his house in Kingswood District. It was 8:15 on a cold January morning. He was dressed in a full suit because he had hearings scheduled at court at 10 a.m., and he was simply doing what any parent does, preparing the car to take his 3-year-old daughters to daycare before going to work. But for Officer Ryan Mitchell driving that cruiser, the sight of a black man in a suit loading baby equipment into a car in a predominantly white neighborhood apparently was sufficient reason for suspicion and intervention. What happened in the next 32 minutes, all captured by Mitchell's body cam and the security camera of Harrison's own house, would become one of the most embarrassing and costly examples of racial profiling ever documented. An incident that would destroy an officer's career and force an entire police department to confront its systematic prejudices. Before diving into this story that will show exactly what happens when casual racism meets someone with real power to demand accountability, tell me, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about what you think should happen to police officers who stop people without any legitimate cause beyond racist assumptions. Because this story will give you every reason to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the wrong person is chosen to harass. Michael Harrison was 42 years old and had served as family court judge for the county for 7 years after a distinguished career as a public defender, where he represented hundreds of indigent clients with dedication that earned him respect from both colleagues and judges before whom he argued. He was known in the judicial system as fair but firm, someone who took the law seriously, but also understood the complex realities of families appearing in his courtroom. His decisions were rarely overturned on appeal because he was meticulous in following legal precedent, while also applying appropriate human compassion to situations often involving vulnerable children and struggling parents. Fellow judges respected him. Lawyers practicing before him admired him even when they disagreed with his rulings, and his reputation was one of absolute integrity in a system that didn't always reward such virtue. He had lived in Kingswood District for 4 years, an upper-middle-class neighborhood, where he and his wife Angela, who worked as a pediatrician at the Children's Hospital downtown, had bought a 2-story brick house specifically because the public schools were excellent and the area was safe to raise their twin daughters. They were one of 3 black families on a street with 22 houses, a fact Michael was painfully aware of, but that he had chosen not to let prevent him from providing his daughters with the best possible opportunities. Angela was already at the hospital that morning, having left at 6 a.m. for a shift starting at 7, leaving Michael responsible for the morning routine with the twins, something he did regularly and enjoyed, despite the organized chaos that came with preparing 2 3-year-olds for the day. The twins, Emma and Sophia, were strapped in their car seats inside the car, singing Frozen songs off-key, but enthusiastically, while Michael folded the double stroller and tried to fit it in the trunk already partially filled with work briefcase, diaper bag, and the girls' backpacks with changes of clothes and favorite blankets the daycare required. It was a completely normal scene of a busy family morning, the kind of mundane moment happening in thousands of homes across the country every day. But when you're a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, even the most innocent and ordinary activities can be viewed through a lens of suspicion by people conditioned to associate blackness with criminality, regardless of context or evidence. Officer Mitchell stopped the cruiser directly in front of Harrison's house and exited the vehicle with that casual authority posture police adopt when about to do what they consider routine investigation, but is often thinly disguised racial profiling. Michael noticed the cruiser immediately, his heart sinking slightly because he knew from personal and professional experience exactly how these situations tended to unfold. He had presided over cases involving questionable police stops, had read countless reports describing how black citizens were disproportionately stopped and questioned in their own neighborhoods. And now he was about to become a statistic in data he cited in court decisions. But he maintained his composure, continued folding the stroller while watching Mitchell approach through the car window's reflection. Mitchell walked to the sidewalk and then onto Harrison's driveway with confident steps, his hand resting casually on. His belt near where his weapon was holstered, the body cam on his chest recording everything. He called out to Michael before even being close enough for normal conversation, his voice loud and loaded with performative authority that immediately signaled this wouldn't be a friendly neighborhood interaction. Mitchell asked what Michael was doing, as if loading a baby stroller into a car trunk in one's own driveway was suspicious activity requiring explanation to a uniformed stranger. Michael took a deep breath, forced a professional smile he had perfected over years navigating situations where his race made people uncomfortable, and responded calmly that he was preparing to take his daughters to daycare before going to work. Mitchell didn't seem satisfied with that perfectly reasonable answer. He moved closer, his eyes scanning the car's interior where the twins had stopped singing and were now watching the police officer with that silent curiosity small children have when something unusual is happening. Mitchell asked if this was Michael's car, if this was his house, questions that immediately signaled he was assuming a black man in a suit couldn't legitimately be there in that neighborhood doing normal father activities. Michael felt the familiar mixture of anger and exhaustion that came from having to prove you belong in your own space, but kept his voice calm and professional while responding that yes, this was his house he had bought 4 years ago, and yes, this was his car registered in his name. He even offered to show his driver's license if Mitchell really needed to verify, though the irony of having to show identification in his own driveway wasn't lost on him. But it was when Mitchell asked the question that crossed the line from questionable investigation to something much more sinister. He asked if Michael had permission from the children's parents to take them, as if the possibility that these were actually his own daughters hadn't even occurred to him. The body cam captured the exact moment Michael's expression changed, that professional smile disappearing completely replaced by a look of cold disbelief. Michael responded with a voice maintaining superficial calm, but that anyone with trained ears could detect the underlying tension, saying these were his daughters, Emma and Sophia Harrison, and that he was their father trying to take them to daycare, as he did every morning when his wife worked early hospital shifts. He pointed to the car seats permanently installed in the back seat, to the personalized backpacks with the girls' names, to the familiar mess of toys and children's books scattered on the car floor. Mitchell didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down on his baseless suspicion, saying he had received reports of suspicious activity in the area, and that he needed to verify the situation completely. Michael asked directly what suspicious activity specifically, what report had been made, because as far as he knew, the only activity happening was a black father wearing a suit preparing to take his daughters to school. The question hung in the air between them, and Mitchell clearly had no good answer because the truth was there was no report, no suspicious activity beyond racist assumptions that made him stop in the first place. The body cam captured the uncomfortable silence, captured Mitchell shifting weight from one foot to another, captured the twins starting to whimper in the back seat because the morning routine had been interrupted, and they could feel the tension even without fully understanding what was happening. That's when Michael's neighbor, a woman named Patricia Reynolds who lived 2 houses down, came out to get her morning newspaper and saw the police cruiser in the Harrisons' driveway. Patricia knew Michael and Angela well. Her own granddaughters played with the Harrison twins on regular playdates, and she immediately sensed something was wrong. She walked to Michael's property with determined steps, her bathrobe still tied, but her posture erect with that confidence coming from 73 years of life and not being afraid to speak up when witnessing injustice. She called Michael by name, asking if everything was okay, and then turned to Mitchell and asked directly why he was bothering her neighbor, who was obviously just trying to take his daughters to school. Patricia's intervention changed the dynamic immediately, because now there was a witness, someone who knew Michael and could verify his identity and residence. Mitchell tried to explain to Patricia he was just doing his job, checking a potentially suspicious situation. But Patricia wasn't having any of it. She said in a loud, clear voice, perfectly captured by the body cam, that she had known Judge Harrison and his family for 4 years, that he was a wonderful father and respected community member, and that the only suspicious thing she saw was a police officer harassing a black man in his own home without any apparent reason beyond racial profiling. The use of the title judge made Mitchell visibly pause, his expression changing from confident to something like growing concern. He asked Michael if he was really a judge, and Michael calmly confirmed that, yes, he was Judge Harrison of the county family court, and that now he was late for scheduled hearings because he was being detained without legitimate cause in his own driveway. The realization of what he had done began penetrating Mitchell's consciousness with the force of a freight train. He had stopped and questioned a judge, someone who understood the law better than most police officers, someone with connections throughout the entire judicial system, someone who could and very likely would ensure there were real consequences for this unjustified stop. Mitchell began verbally backpedaling, saying he was just being careful, that with all the car crimes happening in the area, he had to check unusual situations. But Michael cut that excuse line immediately, pointing out there was nothing unusual about a father loading a baby stroller into his own car in his own driveway, and that if Mitchell found that suspicious, then clearly his criteria for suspicion were based on something beyond observable behavior, something like the skin color of the father in question. Mitchell tried to end the encounter at that point, saying he had just checked the situation and Michael was free to go, as if that resolved the problem of having stopped an innocent citizen without probable cause. But Michael wasn't ready to simply let it go and move on as if nothing had happened. He informed Mitchell calmly but firmly that he wanted his badge number, his full name, and his supervisor's name, because he would be filing a formal complaint about that unjustified stop. The body cam captured Mitchell hesitating, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that his actions were being documented not only by his own camera, but would now also be part of an official report a judge would be submitting. Patricia remained there as a supportive witness, her arms crossed while watching Mitchell struggle with the realization he had made a significant mistake that wasn't just going to disappear because he decided to back down. Michael pulled out his own phone and began taking photos of the police cruiser, the vehicle identification number, and Mitchell standing there in the driveway. He explained in a clear voice he was documenting everything because in his experience as a judge presiding over police misconduct cases, he knew exactly how important photographic evidence was beyond verbal testimony. Mitchell weakly protested that this wasn't necessary, that he had just done his job. But Michael responded that if Mitchell really believed he had done his job appropriately, then he shouldn't have a problem with complete documentation of the encounter. The twins in the back seat had progressed from whimpering to openly crying now, frightened by the tension, and confused about why their father was having such a serious conversation with a stranger instead of taking them to school where their friends and familiar teachers waited. That's when another car slowed down on the street, and a man quickly got out, running toward the Harrisons' driveway. It was David Chen, another neighbor who lived across the street and who had seen the confrontation through his living room window while having breakfast. David was an immigration lawyer and had worked with Michael on cases where family court issues overlapped with immigration status, and he immediately recognized his friend and colleague was being subjected to racial profiling. David approached and identified himself as a lawyer and neighbor, asking Michael if he needed legal assistance. The presence of a second white neighbor defending Michael seemed to make Mitchell fully realize how bad this situation looked. A lone officer detaining a black man in his own home while multiple white neighbors came out to defend him and testify against the officer's conduct. Michael thanked David, but said he was perfectly capable of handling the legal situation himself, though he appreciated the support. He then turned his attention completely back to Mitchell and asked a series of questions with legal precision that made it clear he wasn't an ordinary citizen who could be intimidated or deceived about his rights. Michael asked what was the specific probable cause for the initial stop, what specific crime Mitchell suspected was being committed, if there was any investigation order or search warrant justifying questioning him on his own property, if Mitchell had received a suspect description matching his appearance. Each question was asked in that calm, professional tone judges use in courtrooms when methodically dismantling a weak argument, and each question made Mitchell look more uncomfortable because he obviously had no legitimate answers for any of them. Mitchell finally admitted there was no specific crime report, that he had simply found the situation worthy of investigation when he saw Michael loading equipment in the driveway. Michael pressed further, asking what specifically about a man in a suit loading a baby stroller on a weekday morning seemed criminal or even unusual. Mitchell tried to say something about unusual timing and behavior not fitting the neighborhood pattern, but that explanation sounded even weaker, spoken aloud, especially with Patricia and David there, listening with expressions of growing disbelief. Patricia actually laughed sarcastically at that point, saying she saw Michael take his daughters to school every week, and there was absolutely nothing unusual about it, unless you thought black men couldn't be dedicated fathers in middle-class neighborhoods. Michael's own home security camera had captured the entire interaction from a different angle, clearly showing the moment Mitchell stopped the cruiser, the way he approached with hand-near weapon, the entire conversation that followed. Michael mentioned this to Mitchell, pointing to the camera mounted under his house's eave, explaining that beyond his body cam, there would be independent recording of everything that had happened there that morning. He also mentioned that several other houses on the street had doorbell and security cameras that had probably captured at least parts of the interaction. Mitchell looked around and seemed to realize for the first time how many potential cameras were pointed at that scene. How many pieces of evidence would exist, showing he had stopped and questioned a black man without any legal justification beyond race-based assumptions. Mitchell finally provided his badge number and supervisor contact information, his voice noticeably less confident than when he had initially approached Michael. He tried once more to smooth the situation, suggesting it had just been a misunderstanding and didn't need to become a formal matter. But Michael made it absolutely clear this would definitely be a formal matter, that as a judge who regularly saw consequences of racial profiling in cases coming to his courtroom, he had a responsibility to ensure this incident was fully investigated and documented. He explained he wasn't doing this for personal revenge, but because if he, someone with legal education and position of authority, simply let it go when racially profiled, then what message did that send to all other victims of racial profiling who didn't have his resources or platform to demand accountability? The twins continued crying in the back seat, and Michael finally told Mitchell he needed to care for his daughters who were clearly distressed by the situation Mitchell had created. He informed Mitchell he expected a complete copy of the body cam recording of that encounter within 72 hours, that he would be contacting the police chief personally, and that Mitchell should expect to hear more about this through official channels. Patricia offered to serve as a witness for any investigation or proceeding that might result, and David did the same, both providing their phone numbers and email addresses to Michael right there in front of Mitchell. The body cam captured everything, including Mitchell's increasingly miserable expression as he realized he had chosen absolutely the wrong person to racially profile, and the consequences of that choice would likely haunt his career. Michael finally got into his car, checked that the twins were secure in their car seats despite still being tearful, and drove to daycare with Mitchell still standing uncomfortably in the driveway watching. The daycare teachers immediately noticed the girls were upset, and when Michael briefly explained what had happened, they expressed outrage and support, with the daycare director offering to write a statement if needed about how Michael was a dedicated regular parent who had never given any reason for concern. Michael thanked her, but said it probably wouldn't be necessary, given the volume of video evidence and witnesses, then drove to court already knowing he would be late for his first scheduled hearing, something that rarely happened in his meticulously organized career. When he arrived at court, Michael went directly to the presiding judge's office, a man named Thomas Bradley, who had served on the bench for 25 years and had deep respect for Michael, both as a colleague and as a jurist. Michael succinctly explained why he was late, describing the incident with Mitchell without dramatization or emotional exaggeration, just facts presented with the clarity he would use describing evidence in a court decision. Bradley listened with an expression that progressed from surprise to barely contained anger, because he also understood the implications of what had happened. A sitting judge being stopped and questioned without cause on his own property wasn't just personal injustice against Michael. It was an attack on the dignity of the entire judiciary and clear demonstration of how deeply rooted racial profiling was in local police practices. Bradley immediately offered the court's full support, including legal resources if Michael decided to pursue civil action, and suggested Michael should also consider reporting the incident to the city's Police Oversight Commission in addition to the departmental complaint. He mentioned there had been other informal reports of officers stopping black citizens without adequate cause in that Kingswood district, but many victims had chosen not to file formal complaints out of fear of retaliation, or simply because they didn't believe it would make a difference. Michael, as a judge filing a formal complaint with multiple witnesses and video evidence, could be the catalyst for broader investigation of discriminatory practices that had been ignored too long. Michael agreed this was bigger than just his personal experience, that he had both platform and responsibility to use this situation to potentially create systemic change. That afternoon, after Michael finished his court hearings, he personally went to police department headquarters and requested a meeting with Police Chief Daniel Morrison. The receptionist initially tried to schedule for the following week, but when Michael identified himself as Judge Harrison and explained he had an urgent matter related to officer misconduct that morning, he was taken to Morrison's office within 15 minutes. Morrison knew Michael by reputation and from occasional professional interactions when police cases came to family court, and his expression showed genuine surprise when Michael described what had happened. Morrison listened to the entire account without interruption, his jaw visibly tightening when Michael got to the part where Mitchell had questioned whether he had permission to be with his own daughters. Morrison immediately apologized for Mitchell's behavior and promised a full investigation. But Michael made it clear verbal apologies weren't enough. He wanted to know what policies the department had about investigative stops, what training officers received on racial profiling, what oversight existed to identify patterns of discriminatory stops, and what consequences officers faced when violating citizens' constitutional rights. Morrison admitted the department could improve in all these areas, that implicit bias training was minimal, and oversight of individual stops was inconsistent at best. Michael responded that those admissions were appreciated but needed to be followed by concrete action, including complete review of Mitchell's stops over the past 2 years to see if there was a pattern of racial profiling, improved mandatory training for all officers, and real consequences for Mitchell that would send a clear message this behavior wouldn't be tolerated. The police department's internal investigation began within 24 hours of the incident, conducted by an internal affairs team that knew this case had extraordinary scrutiny given the victim's profile. They reviewed Mitchell's body cam recording frame by frame, interviewed Patricia and David as witnesses, obtained Michael's security camera footage, and examined Mitchell's complete stop history from the past 3 years. What they discovered was disturbing, but not surprising to anyone familiar with research on racial profiling in law enforcement. Mitchell had made 147 investigative stops during that 3-year period, and 112 of them, approximately 76%, involved Black or Hispanic citizens despite the district where he patrolled being only 28% people of color. Even more revealing, only 19 of those 147 stops had resulted in any kind of citation or arrest, meaning the vast majority were baseless stops, wasting innocent citizens' time and undermining public trust in policing. Internal affairs investigators also discovered Mitchell had received 3 previous informal complaints about discriminatory behavior, all filed away without substantial investigation because victims hadn't followed up with formal written complaints, and because Mitchell's supervisors had dismissed concerns as misunderstandings or citizens with bad attitudes toward police. One of the previous complaints was particularly similar to Michael's incident. Involving a Black university professor, Mitchell had stopped while the professor was loading laboratory equipment into his car at the university, apparently because Mitchell didn't believe a Black man could legitimately have access to those facilities. That previous victim had complained to Mitchell's supervisor at the time, but when no action was taken and the supervisor suggested maybe the professor should be more cooperative with officers doing their job, the victim had given up pursuing additional justice. The internal affairs report concluded Mitchell had violated multiple departmental policies, including conducting stops without reasonable cause grounded in articulable facts, failing to treat all citizens with dignity and respect regardless of race, and demonstrating a pattern of discriminatory bias in his patrol decisions. They recommended Mitchell be suspended without pay pending disciplinary hearing, that he complete extensive mandatory training on implicit bias and constitutional policing practices before being considered for return to active duty, and that he be placed on 2-year probation with increased supervision of all his future stops. But Michael, when informed of these recommendations, made it clear they weren't sufficient given the documented pattern of behavior and harm Mitchell had caused not just to him, but to over 100 other citizens over the years. Michael decided to move forward with civil action against Mitchell personally and against the police department for negligent supervision, violation of constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment, and intentional emotional distress. His lawyers argued the department knew or should have known about Mitchell's pattern of discriminatory stops, but had failed to take corrective action, thus creating institutional liability beyond the officer's individual misconduct. The action sought compensatory damages for the 20 minutes Michael had lost that morning, for the emotional trauma of being treated like a criminal in front of his small daughters, and for damage to his dignity and reputation. More importantly, it sought substantial punitive damages intended to punish the department for its systemic failure and send a message that ignoring patterns of racial discrimination had real financial cost that couldn't be ignored. The lawsuit also included a request for injunctive relief, mandating the department implement comprehensive reforms, including early warning system, to identify officers with patterns of disproportionate stops based on race, regular mandatory training on implicit bias and constitutional policing, supervisory review of all investigative stops to ensure they were based on adequate legal foundation, and creation of independent community review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. Michael's lawyers argued that without these systemic reforms, the department would continue producing officers like Mitchell, who felt they were free to stop and harass citizens of color without consequences. The lawsuit quickly gained media attention, with civil rights organizations praising Michael for using his position and resources to fight not just for personal justice, but for change that would benefit countless other potential victims of racial profiling. The story spread beyond the local community, with national news outlets picking up the narrative of a family court judge being stopped by police while taking his own daughters to school. The body cam video was eventually released to the public after Michael signed a waiver permitting its disclosure because he wanted people to see exactly what racial profiling looked like, how it could happen to anyone regardless of education or professional position, and how important it was to document and confront rather than simply accept as inevitable cost of being black in America. The video went viral, generating millions of views and reigniting national conversations about police reform and accountability. Commentators pointed out the bitter irony that even a judge, someone who literally worked within the criminal justice system, wasn't immune to being treated as a suspect based solely on his race. Mitchell was placed on administrative leave while the civil case was pending, effectively ending his career in law enforcement even before any formal resolution, because no department would want to hire him with a high profile. Racial profiling lawsuit and viral video evidence showing his misconduct. Some officers within the department privately defended Mitchell, arguing he was being scapegoated for practices common throughout law enforcement, and that his only real offense was choosing the wrong victim who had resources to fight back. But that argument really only proved the point Michael was making, that racial profiling was indeed systemic, and the real problem wasn't that Mitchell got caught, but that countless other officers did the same thing every day with victims who didn't have power to demand accountability. The civil case was resolved 18 months after the incident through a settlement that avoided trial, but included terms going far beyond simple financial compensation. The city agreed to pay Michael $850,000 in damages, recognizing both the constitutional violation and emotional suffering caused by racial profiling. But more significant than the monetary payment were the structural reforms the settlement mandated. The police department was required to implement comprehensive data collection system on all investigative stops, including race of person stopped, articulated reason for stop and outcome, with quarterly analysis by independent expert to identify patterns of racial disparity, officers demonstrating statistically significant patterns of disproportionate stops based on race would automatically be subject to review and additional training, and persistent failure to correct behavior would result in removal from patrol duty. The settlement also required creation of community review board with real authority, not just symbolic advisory body, but independent entity with subpoena power, access to all body cam recordings and incident reports, and authority to make binding recommendations on officer discipline in cases involving allegations of racial profiling or excessive force. Half the board members had to be residents of communities of color disproportionately affected by police practices. The department was required to increase implicit bias training from single annual 2-hour session to ongoing quarterly program, including role-playing exercises, review of real misconduct cases, and facilitation by outside experts in racial justice. All training curriculum had to be approved by Community Review Board before implementation. Mitchell was terminated as part of the settlement. His law enforcement certification, permanently revoked by the state after reviewing not just the incident with Michael, but the entire documented pattern of discriminatory stops throughout his career. He tried to appeal the decision through the police union, but even the union backed down when faced with the volume of evidence and public pressure from the case. Mitchell eventually left the state entirely, his attempt to start a new career in another jurisdiction frustrated by the fact that any online search of his name immediately revealed the viral video and extensive media coverage of his misconduct. Some years later, there were reports he was working private security in a different state, but his career in public law enforcement was definitely over. He never made significant public apology to Michael or acknowledged the harm he had caused beyond statements written by lawyers as part of legal proceedings. Michael used part of the settlement money to establish a scholarship fund for students of color pursuing careers in law, law enforcement, or social justice, wanting to ensure the next generation of people working within these systems better reflected the communities they served. He also donated a significant amount to local civil rights organizations, providing free legal assistance to victims of racial profiling who lacked resources to hire private lawyers. In interviews about the case, Michael always emphasized he'd been lucky to have camera evidence, witnesses willing to speak up, resources to hire good lawyers, and professional position, making people take his complaints seriously. He pointed out countless other victims of racial profiling didn't have these advantages, and often suffered in silence or saw their complaints dismissed without serious investigation. The Community Review Board, established as part of the settlement, proved more effective than many skeptics had predicted. In its first 2 years of operation, the board reviewed 47 complaints of police misconduct, sustained 23 after investigation, and made recommendations resulting in 3 additional officer terminations, 12 suspensions and mandatory remedial training for 31 officers. More importantly, the mere existence of independent oversight with real authority changed police behavior in measurable ways. The number of complaints about racial profiling dropped 42% in the 2 years after implementation of reforms, and analysis of stop data showed significant reduction in racial disparities as officers became more aware their stops were being monitored and discriminatory patterns would have consequences. Michael continued serving as family court judge, his reputation if anything strengthened by the fact he had taken a stand against injustice even when it affected him personally. Lawyers practicing before him noted he seemed to bring even more empathy to cases involving families navigating the criminal justice system, particularly those where parents of color were dealing with law enforcement in ways echoing his own experience. He occasionally spoke at police training events about the incident, not to humiliate the department, but to provide first-hand perspective on what racial profiling felt like from the victim's point of view, even when that victim was someone with legal education and position of authority. His message was always that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone, and prevention required honest recognition of the problem and commitment to systemic change, rather than just punishing individual officers after damage was already done. The twins, Emma and Sophia, were too young to fully understand what had happened that morning in the driveway, but as they grew, Michael found age-appropriate ways to explain why the police officer had stopped them, why some people make unfair assumptions based on how others look, and why it was important to speak out against injustice even when difficult or uncomfortable. Angela, Michael's wife, had been deeply shaken by the incident when Michael told her about it, particularly the part where he was questioned whether he had permission to be with his own daughters. As a pediatrician, she had witnessed racial disparities in healthcare and treatment, but hearing her husband was racially profiled while simply being a father to their children brought those inequalities painfully close. She became more active in advocacy within her own profession, speaking about how racial bias affected pediatric care and working to ensure Black families received the same level of respect and attention as white families. Years after the incident, a researcher from a local university public policy center studying effectiveness of police oversight reforms contacted Michael for an interview about the case's long-term impact. The researcher had analyzed the department's stop data and found reductions in racial disparities had persisted and actually improved over time, suggesting reforms had created real cultural change rather than just temporary compliance motivated by public attention. Michael expressed cautious optimism about these findings, noting progress was possible, but continuous vigilance was necessary, because systems tended to revert to old practices when pressure diminished. He emphasized one case, one reform. One department didn't solve the systemic problem of racial profiling throughout American law enforcement, but each individual victory contributed to larger movement toward fairer, more equitable policing. Michael's story became a case study, not just in law schools but in law enforcement training programs across the country, used to illustrate both consequences of racial profiling and importance of accountability and reform. The body cam video was often shown in training seminars, paused at key moments where the instructor could point out exactly where Mitchell went wrong, what questions he should have asked himself before making the stop, how implicit bias influenced his thinking, and what alternatives he had at each decision point. Some officers watching these trainings became defensive, arguing police work was difficult, and it was easy to criticize with hindsight. But others recognized the video showed exactly the kind of policing that damaged community relations and undermined law enforcement legitimacy. Patricia Reynolds and David Chen, the neighbors who had intervened that morning, remained close friends with Michael and Angela, bonded by shared experience and commitment to racial justice in their community. Patricia often said witnessing that incident had fundamentally changed how she thought about racial privilege and responsibility, that she became much more attentive to situations where people of color were treated with suspicion or disrespect, and more willing to speak up, even when uncomfortable. David used his own platform as a lawyer to do pro bono work for victims of police misconduct, inspired by Michael's willingness to use his case not just for personal justice, but for broader systemic change. Both eventually served on the community review board established by the settlement, bringing their perspectives as direct witnesses of what racial profiling looked like and why independent oversight was crucial. The case's legacy extended beyond the local jurisdiction where it occurred. Police departments in other cities studied the reforms implemented as part of Michael's settlement and adopted similar elements in their own policies. Civil rights organizations used the case as a model when negotiating settlements in their own racial profiling lawsuits, pointing to structural reforms mandated in Michael's case as a standard of what meaningful oversight should look like. State legislators referenced the case when proposing legislation requiring uniform data collection on police stops and creation of community review boards with real authority. The case proved accountability was possible, that reforms could be forced even when institutions resisted change, and that sometimes all it took was one victim with resources, knowledge, and determination to fight not just for personal justice but for systemic transformation benefiting countless others. Michael reflected years later that he never wished to go through that experience, that loading 3-year-old twins into daycare while being treated as a criminal suspect left scars that didn't completely disappear even after financial settlement and institutional reforms. But he also acknowledged using his position, relative privilege as someone with legal education and established career, and platform coming from being a judge to force change had transformed traumatic experience into something with broader meaning and impact. He hoped other victims of racial profiling saw his case and knew documenting, reporting, and persisting in seeking accountability could make a difference, that the system wasn't completely impenetrable or immutable, and that even against powerful institutions with all resources and incentive to protect their own, justice was, sometimes, just sometimes, achievable for those determined enough to demand it.